Hello. In this presentation, we're going to talk about three things, and I will end up dividing this presentation, I believe, into three separate sections. We will talk about Romanticism, our first literary period. We will talk about a few literary devices, some of your vocabulary terms, and we will talk about our first short story, Young Goodman Brown. All right, so let's start by talking about literary periods and what that term means. When we talk about literary periods, we're referring to a collection of literature written during a time period in which historians, literary critics look back on that era and notice that the art during that time, whether it is visual arts, paintings, sculptures, things like that, or if it's literary arts or plays or music, that they share a certain number of characteristics. And they say, okay, so a lot of artists during this time seem to believe this, seem to use this kind of style, preferred this kind of art, and then they name it and list some characteristics of that. So literary periods are kind of like trends. One doesn't end as soon as another one becomes popular. Instead, they kind of fade in and fade out like any fad you would see on Instagram or TikTok. So for that reason, the years and the dates that I give you are a little bit flexible. These literary periods do overlap a little bit with each other, and they tend to respond to the literary period before it, or be a reflection of that period, growth on that period, or they might decide they're going in a completely different direction than the last literary period. All right, so let's talk about the first one in which we begin to see short stories, and that is Romanticism. So Romanticism got its start during the French Revolution. For each of these for each of these literary periods, I'm going to try to give you kind of a basis of how and why it started. And since it does reflect all art, not just literature, I'm going to show you some pictures as well. So the French Revolution started in 1789. Literary Romanticism kind of got its start in England in 1798. But that would not have happened had it not been for the French Revolution in '89. So I have a picture for you here in which you see several peasants climbing a tower in order to fly the French flag. So this kind of encapsulated the spirit of revolution that Romanticism was founded on. So the pictures you see on the left here, the triangle, has the aristocracy on top and everybody else on the bottom. And there really was no middle class. There wasn't a lot of in between. You had people who had a lot, who had everything they could want and more. And you had more people, most of the people, who had absolutely nothing, who were starving and searching for jobs unsuccessfully and resorting to crime. There just wasn't a lot of opportunity or chance to change your life if you were not born within the aristocracy. So eventually that all came to a head. There's a lot of frustration in which you see everybody in this red group decide maybe life doesn't have to be this way. Just because I wasn't born rich doesn't mean I have to basically stay in the gutter. And you see them reverting to this idea on the right. Instead of being lumped in with this entire group, I am an individual, I am unique, I am not governed by rules at birth, meaning I can take matters into my own hands. I am the master of my own fate, things like that. So the spirit of revolution is what the idea of Romanticism was based on. All right, and I also want to give you, here's another picture, a painting during that time. And I want to give you a quote as well that kind of tries to sum up this idea. So the French Revolution came bringing with it the promise of a brighter day, the promise of regenerated man and regenerated earth. It was hailed with joy and acclamation by the oppressed, by the ardent lovers of humanity, by the poets whose task it is to voice the human spirit. So if I had to give you kind of a buzzword for each literary period, for Romanticism, I would say that the buzzword is optimism. These people, romantics, really truly believed of this idea of regenerated man and regenerated earth. And as Christians, that idea should give us pause. When we talk about regenerated anything, you can think of it as regenerated, renewed, and that's a term that hopefully you associate with Christ, with redemption, with his initial coming and sacrifice and death and resurrection. And then again, this idea that man and earth will be regenerated upon his return. This is not something that mankind can do in and of itself, by itself, for itself. It is outside of our control because we have a sin nature and we are living in a sinful world. So as optimistic and well-meaning as a lot of Romanticism was, it was kind of doomed from the start. So this regenerated man and regenerated earth, this idea that we could fix ourselves, that society could fix society, fell flat, and it fell flat very quickly. If you know anything about the French Revolution, you know that it ended very, very bloody, with the execution of many, many, many French aristocrats in an effort to kind of equalize things, so they said. But really, it was a lot of revenge and a lot of blood that didn't get them anywhere. So if you look a little bit further, it was hailed with joy and acclamation by the oppressed, by the ardent lovers of humanity, by the poets whose task it is to voice the human spirit. So this is where we see that French Revolution, the spirit of revolution, coming into literary romanticism. Romantic poets, especially the British ones, the first British ones would have been Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and William Wordsworth, who wrote Prelude. He wrote many things that you probably have read, whether you remember that or not, in British Lit and in high school. And we will read one of his poems in this class. They truly believed that as poets, it was their task to promote the spirit of revolution, to get other people to recognize the tenets of Romanticism and to start to believe them. If you'll see, this picture here is a picture of the French Revolution. It's a painting, I should say, rather than a picture. And what you see is a battle scene. You see these men here who have died and other men who are still fighting. This figure of victory or independence, again flying the French flag. And it makes something as horrific as a battle seem noble or honorable. If it is for the greater good, then it is something worth doing. And I want you to hold on to that idea when we move to our next literary periods. I'll refer to this again. All right, so let's look at the characteristics of Romanticism. And when I say Romanticism, for the next couple of slides, I'm talking about kind of the European version where Romanticism was born and then crafted very specifically by artists. So here are some of the characteristics you would see in British Romanticism. And I've highlighted and put in bold the three that you will see carry over into the American short story that we're going to read, Youngcomb and Brown. All right, so this idea of individuality, again, that just because I was born in this position of life doesn't mean I have to stay there. Along with that, you get freedom from oppression, and then youth and innocence. And here, when we say youth and innocence, we don't mean that in a literal way, that you can only encapsulate the romantic spirit if you're young and free of crime or free of sin. They're talking about an attitude, that you're still optimistic, that you don't get kind of old and set in your ways and curmudgeonly just because you age, things like that, that you still maintain that optimism. A connection to nature is extremely important in all versions of Romanticism. There's this belief that nature has this healing quality, that you can become a better person, a better man, a better society by remaining connected to nature. This is going to be hard to believe if you've read Young, Goodman, and Brown or many of the Romantic works, but they really did believe that literature was for the common man. This is more clear if you're able to see it in context with the literary period that came before it, neoclassicism. And I want you to remember that word for your test. It's a good, another little buzzword for you to remember for the definition of Romanticism, that it's a reaction to neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was a very formal, very convoluted, complex way of writing that was really only meant for educated white men, to write for other educated white men. It was very difficult to read if you did not have a formal education. And at that point in time, only a certain segment of society would have had that formal education. So the Romantics said, we don't want literature to be just for people who are rich, just for people who are educated. We want everybody to have access to this. That has to do with their love of individuality and freedom from oppression. So even though we may look at Hawthorne and think, wow, this is not written in my version of everyday language, it would have been so much more accessible to the average person during this time period, the late 1700s, early 1800s, than the literature written 50 years before that. All right. Also, this belief in mysticism or spirituality, this is not the same thing as Christianity. This is, again, it goes with that connection to nature, that there is good and evil in the world, and people are susceptible to that. And then the third one, there's a lot of internal reflection in these pieces. So often they tend to be very low on action. Unfortunately, they're low on action, and there's a lot of people walking around, often in nature, thinking about what they've done, what they should do, what has happened to them. And I'm going to go to the next slide and give you some examples of that. All right, so Romantic authors and works, I just listed some that I think most people have read or heard of or been exposed to in some way, shape, or form. So Les Mis by Victor Hugo, of course, it was originally a novel and became a Broadway musical and a play and a movie. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who also wrote the short story we're going to talk about in a minute. And then Edgar Allan Poe, anything he wrote, The Telltale Heart, Fall of the House of Usher, the poem Annabel Lee, The Raven. All of those would be examples of Romantic authors and works. Now at the bottom there, I have The Dark Knight Rises. Not that that is necessarily a romantic work, but because the director of the film has talked about pulling certain ideas and themes from the Charles Dickens novel, A Tale of Two Cities. A Tale of Two Cities is a Victorian work that is talking about the French Revolution. It's reflecting on what happened, and it talks about the struggle between those who have everything and those who have nothing. And in The Dark Knight Rises, you might remember a scene in which the rich men and women of Gotham were put on trial. And whether they confessed their guilt or not, they were likely going to die. You saw that in The Dark Knight Rises. You saw that in A Tale of Two Cities. And it was what happened in the French Revolution when things started to go bad, when It became clear that man could not regenerate man, and man could not regenerate the earth because of our sinful nature. So I just added that in because I thought many of you would have been exposed to that. So if I go back and talk about that internal reflection, stories are very, very dramatic, but again, surprisingly low on action. And I'll give you Frankenstein as an example. If any of you have watched a Frankenstein movie, then the scene in which Frankenstein's monster comes to life is often very, very dramatic. It's very cinematic. There's a light show, and it's a main part of the story. If you have read Frankenstein, however, the moment where Frankenstein's monster comes to life is maybe a paragraph long. The book is mostly Victor Frankenstein, the doctor, the creator, reflecting on what he has done and worrying about what will happen because of what he has done, facing the consequences of what he has done. So there's a lot of thinking about things and a lot less action. I threw in a picture of the Three Musketeers, which again in a movie is action-packed, but when you read it, it is a lot of internal reflection. The same thing with the Scarlet Letter. It's about a woman who has had an affair with a man, and they have this secret love child, and everybody in their small town of Salem is critical of this, but it's mostly a woman trying to deal with the consequences of her sin, and a man trying to hide the fact that he is this child's father. And very little action takes place for kind of such a juicy story. So again, there is a lot of internal reflection here. All right, so let's go to all of what I just talked about: Les Mis, Frankenstein, all of these, and A Tale of Two Cities. All of those are European versions of Romanticism. But Edgar Allan Poe and Hawthorne are American, and they're what we call dark romantics. So dark romantics are what the Americans tend to and be inclined toward. So let me read this quote. Dark romanticism is distinguished from romanticism in its emphasis on human fallibility and sin. They are pessimists, whereas romantics believe in human goodness. They are optimists. So this goes back to that idea that the spirit of revolution, romantics, believed in regenerated earth and regenerated man, and that they had that power. Dark romantics recognize, no, humans are fallible and they are sinful, and we cannot do that. So according to dark romantics, even good men and women drift towards sin and self-destruction, and there can be unintended consequences that arise from well-intended social reforms. And that is a good deal of what you see in Young Goodman Brown with Nathaniel Hawthorne. All right, so now that we have talked about romanticism, I do have a couple of slides here on Young Goodman Brown and our literary terms. But for the sake of keeping lectures on the short side, we're almost at 20 minutes. I'm going to cut it here, and you can pick up with part 2 when you have time.